They weren't canceled. They were buried. In the final months of World War II, multiple governments terminated projects that had already succeeded. Not failed, succeeded. The official explanation was demobilization. The records tell a different story. Files were sealed. Scientists reassigned. Test results removed from archives that otherwise survived intact. This isn't about secret weapons that never worked. It's about systems that worked too well. Some projects threatened post-war treaties. Some crossed ethical lines no victory could justify. Some revealed capabilities leaders didn't want civilians or allies to know existed. The war ended. The secrecy didn't. Across 3 continents, the same suppression language appears, the same classification stamps, the same gaps where conclusions should be. And there's a cost. Careers destroyed, victims erased, technologies quietly folded into peacetime life. Strip their origins, ignore these projects, and history looks cleaner than it was. Understand them. And the modern world looks very different because some weapons were never meant to be remembered. World War II was not just a military conflict. It was the largest uncontrolled research environment in human history. Under emergency conditions, governments authorized experiments that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Timelines collapsed. Oversight vanished. Results mattered more than consequences. Most people assume the most dangerous projects are the famous ones. The atomic bomb, radar, rockets. Those survived because they could be framed as necessary, strategic, controllable. The project you are about to hear did not fit that narrative. They were not obscure. In several cases, they were prioritized, funded, and proven. What followed was not celebration, but silence. Programs were terminated without public explanation. Final reports were fragmented. Personnel were transferred, sometimes across borders, sometimes into entirely different fields. When historians later searched for conclusions, they found only beginnings. This pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. First, emergency authorization under existential threat. Second, rapid development and real-world testing. Third, confirmation of effectiveness. Fourth, internal alarm, ethical, political, or strategic. Fifth, suppression. The suppression takes familiar forms. Classification beyond wartime norms. Seizure orders. Non-disclosure agreements that outlive the participants. In some cases, deliberate ridicule to discredit the idea. In others, quiet absorption into post-war programs with the original context erased. What binds these 10 projects together is not nationality or ideology. It is behavior. Identical language in declassified memos. Matching redaction codes across different countries. The same small circle of agencies appearing again and again long after the war ended. And there is a reason this matters now. World War II records are crossing their 80-year declassification thresholds. Private archives are being digitized. Personal papers are surfacing from families who were told never to speak. In the last decade, historians have noticed something unsettling. Not what's revealed, but what's still missing. Entire conclusions are gone. If these projects were failures, there will be no reason to hide them. Failure leaves paperwork. Success creates liability. What follows are 10 World War II projects officially described as abandoned, impractical, or irrelevant. The evidence suggests otherwise. And the first story was already classified before the war ended. Story 1, Project Habakkuk, Britain's ice aircraft carrier. In 1942, at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, Britain faced a lethal gap. German U-boats controlled the mid-ocean air void. Too far for land-based aircraft, too vast for conventional carriers. Into this crisis stepped Geoffrey Pike, an eccentric but respected inventor working under combined operations. His proposal was simple and alarming. Build an aircraft carrier out of ice. Not ordinary ice, but reinforced composite frozen from water and with pulp. It would be enormous, unsinkable, nearly immune to torpedoes. Churchill approved it within weeks. No public debate, no precedent. Then construction began. The material was called pykrete. Laboratory tests showed it behaved unlike ice. It absorbed bullets. It fractured slowly. It melted at a fraction of the expected rate. At the Quebec Conference in 1943, a block was demonstrated to Allied leadership. A bullet shattered normal ice. The pykrete held. U.S. Navy engineers ran stress tests, thermal tests, impact tests. The data was recorded, filed, and circulated. A prototype was built on Patricia Lake in Alberta. It floated. It held weight. It worked. The scans agreed. The math held. The log survived. Then the project stopped. Not gradually. Abruptly. Officially, it was canceled due to cost and changing strategy. Unofficially, The paper trail collapses. Final feasibility reports are missing. Correspondence between Churchill and Mountbatten is partially redacted. Engineers were reassigned without explanation. The prototype was left to melt under guard, rather than dismantled for study. The files that remain carry an unusual classification stamp, extended beyond standard wartime secrecy. No press release followed. No failure report issued. No lessons published. Project Habakkuk vanished from post-war history. Pike was sidelined, his reputation quietly undermined. He never led a major government project again. One senior materials researcher, promised a permanent appointment, was reassigned to clerical duties, and left government service within a year. He missed his daughter's graduation while stationed at the remote test site. Pike itself survived, but only as a curiosity. Its military implications were never openly explored again. Despite clear advantages in survivability and logistics, something had crossed a line. In 1943, all Habakkuk feasibility reports were sealed under extended wartime authority. Story 2, Japanese balloon bomb program, Fugo. In late 1944, Japan initiated an attack on the continental United States. There was no invasion force, no aircraft, no warning. The weapon rode the upper atmosphere. Engineers within the Imperial Japanese Army had identified a narrow, fast-moving air current flowing east from Asia, the jet stream. Using paper, silk, and hydrogen, they designed high-altitude balloons capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean unmanned. Each carried incendiary and anti-personnel bombs, timed to release over North America. The project was named Fugo. It was approved under Wartime Emergency Authority and launched quietly from coastal Japan. This was not speculation. It was deployment. Between November 1944 and April 1945, more than 9,000 balloon bombs were released. U.S. military intelligence recovered intact devices across the western states: Oregon, Washington, Montana, as far east as Michigan. Some were found tangled in power lines. Others landed in forests. Several detonated. Army reports confirmed balloons arrived precisely as designed. The navigation worked. The materials held. Embedded sand ballast traced directly to Japanese beaches. The physics was undeniable. Then something unusual happened. The United States government imposed a total media blackout. Newspapers were instructed not to report the incidents. Radio stations complied. Civil defense agencies were ordered silent. The reason was explicit: Japan must not know the balloons were reaching their target. Internal memos use identical language, deny confirmation, suppress acknowledgement, prevent enemy feedback. Even after devices were found by civilians, officials downplayed them as weather debris. No one replied. The silence held. In May 1945, the suppression failed. Near Bly, Oregon, a balloon bomb detonated during a church picnic. A pregnant woman and 5 children were killed instantly. It was the only known civilian deaths from enemy action on the U.S. mainland during the war. Their names were withheld from national press for weeks. Local authorities were instructed to keep details minimal. The families received no explanation for the secrecy. One father learned the truth years later from a declassified report. He never spoke publicly about it. After the war, Fugo was framed as an ineffective novelty, a failed terror weapon. But internal Army Air Force's assessments disagreed. The balloons had crossed an ocean. They had arrived on schedule. They had detonated as designed. One classified annex noted that had they been launched earlier, during peak fire season, the damage would have been strategically significant. Buried among the technical appendices was a short document dated March 1943, a translated Japanese research memo detailing jet stream velocity calculations, wind speed tables, altitude corrections. It was marked for restricted circulation only. No author listed. The project ended. The balloon stopped. The blackout lifted quietly. The public narrative hardened. Harmless experiment, minimal effect, but the data remained, and someone kept it. By August 1945, all Fugo atmospheric research files were reclassified above standard wartime levels. Story 3, Nazi Bell Precursor Projects, Conventional Physics Only. In 1943, deep inside the Third Reich, a series of experiments began that did not resemble conventional weapons development. They took place far from the front lines, inside restricted SS research facilities in Lower Silesia and Bavaria. The objective was not a bomb or a vehicle or a chemical agent. It was control. over rotation, vibration, and extreme energy density. The work was overseen by a small technical group drawn from military laboratories and private industry. Their apparatus involved counter-rotating drums, high-voltage inputs, and heavy shielding. Power consumption was extreme. Test cycles were brief. Logs describe anomalous heat, unexplained interference with nearby instruments, and effects on organic matter placed too close to the device. This was not folklore. These were routine laboratory notes, written in the language of engineers. The measurements did not behave as expected. Surviving documents show that multiple tests produced identical frequency notations. The same numbers appear again and again, circled in the margins. When Allied intelligence later recovered fragments of these files, analysts noted the repetition, but could not locate the final report. It was missing. What remained were partial schematics, incomplete data tables, and references to an internal success threshold that had allegedly been met in late 1944. Then the program disappeared. As Allied forces advanced, the facilities were dismantled with unusual speed. Equipment was destroyed rather than captured. Some laboratories were flooded. Others were deliberately collapsed. Personnel were reassigned or vanished into the final chaos of the war. One technician, exposed during a high-energy test, was hospitalized with severe neurological symptoms. He never returned to work. His medical file ends mid-sentence. After the war, fragments of the project surfaced indirectly. Several scientists associated with the work appeared in Allied custody, then re-emerged in unrelated research roles. Their wartime activities were reclassified. Intelligence summaries described the program as speculative, impractical, and scientifically unsound. No formal failure analysis was ever published, yet the suppression was thorough. In 1952, surviving documents connected to the experiments were quietly reclassified under a new security framework, not as war crimes, not as abandoned research, as unresolved technical material. The same frequency notation appears one last time on the cover page of a redacted Allied assessment, dated years after Germany's surrender. It matched the figures recorded in a Japanese atmospheric memo from 1943. That coincidence was never explained. By 1952, all remaining files from the program were elevated to permanent restricted status. Story 4, Operation Starvation, Mining Japan from the Air. In early 1945, as the Pacific War dragged toward its conclusion, the United States initiated an operation designed not to shock, but to suffocate. It did not target cities directly. It targeted movement, food, fuel, medicine. The project was called Operation Starvation. Using B-29 bombers, U.S. forces began dropping naval mines into Japan's inland seas, harbors, and shipping lanes. These were not crude explosives. They were magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-sensitive devices engineered to activate only under specific conditions. Aircraft crews deployed them at night, from high altitude with precision. The goal was simple: shut down Japan's maritime arteries without a formal blockade. The results were immediate and measurable. Shipping losses spiked within weeks. Entire ports were rendered unusable. Insurance rates collapsed. Internal Japanese records, captured after the war, show that imports of food and raw materials fell by nearly 90%. Coastal traffic slowed to a crawl. Repair crews worked around the clock and failed. Mines detonated when swept. Others waited. The data was logged meticulously by U.S. analysts. Charts, tonnage graphs, harbor closure timelines. It was one of the most effective interdiction campaigns in naval history. Then it vanished from a narrative. Operation Starvation was classified during the war and minimized afterward. The atomic bomb dominated public memory. The mining campaign, which some planners believe would have forced surrender within months on its own, was reduced to a footnote. No senior commanders promoted it. No medals were issued at scale. The final operational analysis was restricted and circulated internally only. When declassification began decades later, large sections were missing. The consequences, however, were not abstract. Japanese merchant crews continued sailing despite the danger. Many never returned. Entire coastal communities lost fathers and sons without explanation. One U.S. intelligence officer later noted that the operation caused systemic deprivation rather than spectacular destruction. It was efficient and deeply uncomfortable. A naval analyst involved in post-war review was reassigned after questioning whether the results constituted a form of mass civilian targeting. His career stalled. He retired early. Official histories framed Operation Starvation as supplemental, necessary but secondary. The documents suggested otherwise. Internal assessments ranked it among the highest return operations of the entire air campaign. Its suppression appears to have followed a familiar logic. It worked, it was quiet, and it blurred ethical boundaries that victory narratives preferred not to examine. By July 1945, Japanese coastal imports had fallen by nearly 90% under a single classified directive. Story 5, German nerve agent weaponization. By 1938, German chemists had already crossed a threshold most nations didn't know existed. While searching for stronger pesticides, researchers at IG Farben synthesized a substance that killed through nerve disruption. It was called tabun. Soon after came sarin. These were not theoretical compounds. They were stable, measurable, and lethally efficient at doses so small they frightened the scientists who handled them. The work moved quickly into military control. Laboratories produced kilograms, then tons. Munitions were designed, storage bunkers were constructed, and dispersed across Germany. Allied intelligence would later discover these stockpiles intact, sealed, labeled, and never deployed. Field tests confirmed their effects were catastrophic. Respiratory collapse, convulsions, death within minutes. The data was precise. The Germans understood exactly what they had created, and then they didn't use it. This absence became the official story. Because nerve agents were never deployed on the battlefield, post-war narratives implied they were impractical or unfinished. That framing collapses under scrutiny. Internal German documents show deployment plans tied to specific invasion contingencies. Protective gear had been issued to select units. Production continued into late 1944. The capability was real. After the war, the discovery of these agents triggered immediate suppression. Allied governments quietly seized the stockpiles. Scientists were interrogated, then absorbed into Western research programs. Public war crimes trials barely mentioned nerve agents at all. Instead of condemnation, there was silence. Files were classified. Chemical formulas were restricted beyond standard weapons protocols. The true scale of the program was withheld from the public for decades. One lab assistant died during a handling accident in 1944. His death was recorded as equipment failure. His family was never told what he had been exposed to. Some historians argue Germany refrained from using nerve agents solely out of fear of retaliation in kind, not because the weapons themselves were operationally decisive. But that explanation avoids an uncomfortable fact. Once the war ended, the victors did not destroy the knowledge. They preserved it. Within years, similar compounds appeared in the arsenals of multiple nations, developed by scientists who had once worked under the Reich. The chemical arms race accelerated quietly, stripped of its origin story. The agents were real. The restraint was temporary. The secrecy was permanent. By 1950, all captured German nerve agent research was classified above conventional chemical weapons levels. Story 6, Bat Bomb Program, Project X-Ray. In 1942, the United States authorized one of the most unconventional weapons programs of the war. It did not involve missiles or planes or explosives in the traditional sense. It involved animals, thousands of them. The project was designated X-Ray. Its premise was blunt. Use bats as delivery systems for fire. The logic was ruthless. Japanese cities were built largely from wood and paper. Bats could carry small incendiary charges, fly into attics in eves at dawn, and disperse naturally before detonation. One bomber could release thousands. The resulting fires would ignite simultaneously. Overwhelming response efforts. The idea came from a civilian dentist. The military listened. Tests followed. Engineers developed miniature-timed incendiaries. Biologists studied bat hibernation and release behavior. Field trials were conducted in the American Southwest using mock Japanese structures. The results surprised everyone. Bats roost exactly where predicted. Fires spread rapidly. In one test, several armed bats escaped containment and ignited buildings on an active air base. Hangars burned. A general's car was destroyed. The concept worked. That was the problem. The program was immediately contained. Official explanations later described it as impractical and unreliable. Internal reports disagreed. Development timelines showed the weapon could have been operational by mid-1945. Funding reached nearly $2 million. Detailed strike models existed. Then the atomic bomb entered the picture, and Project X-Ray became inconvenient. Publicly, it was ridiculed. Privately, The files were locked down. Final assessments were classified. Footage of successful tests was restricted. Personnel were reassigned without acknowledgement of their work. One handler suffered severe burns during containment failure. He spent months recovering. His role was omitted from official histories. The program's lead biologist never received another government contract. The bat bomb was framed as a curiosity, a footnote, but internal correspondence shows concern not with feasibility, but with optics. Fire started by animals, civilian casualties without a visible attacker, a weapon that bypassed defenses and accountability. The war ended. The project was terminated. The data did not disappear. Elements of the research reappeared years later in studies on dispersal mechanics and autonomous delivery systems. Stripped of context, the origin was never cited. The bats were never mentioned again. By 1944, Project X-ray had consumed over $2 million under sealed authorization. Story 7. Soviet acoustic submarine detection. In the final years of the war, the Soviet Union began work on a project that left no visible trace on the battlefield. There were no explosions, no wreckage, no captured weapons. What they were building listened instead of striking. Along the Black Sea coast, Soviet engineers installed experimental underwater listening systems designed to detect submarines without active sonar. The concept was passive acoustic surveillance, arrays of hydrophones anchored to the seafloor, tuned to pick up engine harmonics and propeller signatures at distance. It required patience, mathematics, and silence. The objective was strategic awareness without revealing presence. Captured German naval records confirmed the Soviets were already testing the system by 1944. Technical schematics recovered after the war show networks of sensors linked by cable, feeding shore-based analysis rooms. Operators logged contact data manually. Speed, direction, tonal patterns. The system worked best when it wasn't used aggressively. It mapped, it waited. Western analysts later noted that the design principles matched sonar systems publicly credited to the early Cold War, except these predated them by years. Then the project was erased. As Soviet influence expanded, references to the wartime listening arrays disappeared from open literature. Engineers associated with the work were reassigned to unrelated industrial posts. One senior designer questioned why the system was being dismantled just as it proved effective. He was arrested on charges of theoretical sabotage and sent to a labor camp. He never returned to research. His name was removed from technical registries. Post-war Western intelligence encountered the project only in fragments: a mislabeled blueprint, a partial intercept summary, an unexplained leap in Soviet undersea awareness in the late 1940s. When analysts attempted to trace its origin, they hit classification walls on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The suppression served a purpose. Passive detection changed naval warfare. It favored patience over firepower. It undermined traditional notions of engagement and escalation. A submarine that is heard without knowing it is being heard is already compromised. Acknowledging that capability would have forced uncomfortable questions about maritime vulnerability. Instead, the technology was reintroduced years later under a different name, a different era, a different war. By 1946, all Black Sea acoustic test records were reclassified under expanded Cold War secrecy statutes. Story 8. Unit 731 data seizure. In August 1945, as Japan moved toward surrender, a separate operation was already underway. It did not involve troops or territory. It involved paper. Truckloads of it, laboratory notes, autopsy records, test results, evidence generated by a covert research unit operating under the Imperial Japanese Army. It was known internally as Unit 731. For years, Unit 731 had conducted human experimentation under wartime secrecy. Prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax. Limbs were frozen and shattered. Organs were removed without anesthesia. The objective was data, not cruelty for its own sake, but measurement, thresholds, survival times, dissemination efficiency. Every procedure was documented. When the war ended, this archive should become the centerpiece of war crimes trials. Instead, it was seized. U.S. intelligence officers negotiated directly with former Unit 731 leadership. The terms were explicit: immunity from prosecution in exchange for full access to the data. No trials, no testimony, no public record. The agreement was finalized quietly, outside the Tokyo Tribunal framework. The victims were excluded entirely. The material was flown to the United States and classified immediately. Internal memoranda show why. The data was extensive. It covered cold tolerance, disease progression, and Critically, large-scale biological dispersal, delivery mechanisms, atmospheric behavior, field viability. One appendix analyzed airborne release under varying wind conditions. Attached was a translated research memo dated March 1943. Jet stream velocity tables, altitude corrections, identical formatting to earlier Japanese military research. It was the same document referenced in suppressed balloon bomb files. This was the payoff. The jet stream calculations used to guide Fugo balloon weapons had been repurposed, not for explosives, for pathogens. U.S. analysts noted the overlap and flagged it as strategically valuable. That phrase appears repeatedly in the margins. The memo was recirculated under restricted distribution. The original author's name was removed. The consequences were absolute. Unit 731 commanders lived out their lives in peace. Some became professors. Some advised pharmaceutical companies. None were tried. The victims remained unnamed. Families never learned what happened. One former prisoner, released before the war's end, searched for records for decades. He died without answers. Publicly, Unit 731 faded into obscurity. Textbooks minimized it. Trials omitted it. The narrative hardened. Limited scope, unreliable data, moral aberration without utility. The classified assessments say otherwise. The data was cited in U.S. biological warfare research into the 1950s. The origin was redacted. The crimes were erased. The knowledge was kept. By 1947, all Unit 731 materials were sealed under U.S. custody at the highest classification level. Story 9, Operation Paperclip's hidden subprojects. By the time World War II officially ended, the United States was already extracting personnel from the ruins of the Reich. The operation was publicly framed as scientific triage, rescuing knowledge before it fell into Soviet hands. Its real scope was narrower and darker. It was called Operation Paperclip. Under Paperclip, more than 700 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were identified, interrogated, and relocated. Their files were reviewed, edited, and stamped for transfer. Criminal affiliations were removed. Party memberships softened. In some cases, entire sections were rewritten. What mattered was usefulness. The subprojects were never publicly listed. Internal documents show that beyond rockets and aeronautics, Paperclip absorbed specialists tied to chemical agents, human endurance research, advanced materials, and unconventional delivery systems. Several names overlap with earlier suppressed programs. The connections were not advertised. They were buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic language. Among the seized materials were translated technical appendices from Japanese research exchanges. One, dated March 1943, concerned upper atmospheric wind modeling, jet stream behavior, payload dispersion. It carried the same tables previously flagged in balloon bomb analysis and biological warfare files. In Paperclip custody, it was refiled as a meteorological reference. The origin was scrubbed. This was not accidental. Paperclip's purpose was not justice. It was continuity. The war had proven what worked. The post-war period was about ownership. Scientists who knew too much were not prosecuted. They were reassigned. Those who asked questions about ethical boundaries were sidelined. One intelligence analyst raised concerns about integrating personnel linked to human experimentation. His memo was marked not actionable. He was transferred out of the program within months. Victims disappeared from the equation. Survivors of camps and experiments searched for accountability and found none. Their cases stalled. Evidence vanished into restricted archives. The men responsible appeared years later in sanitized biographies, credited with advancing American science. The human cost was deliberately severed from the technical achievement. By the early 1950s, Paperclip was officially declared complete. The files were closed. The public story settled. A necessary compromise in a dangerous world. But the pattern was now undeniable. The same data moved from Japan to Germany to the United States. The same research threads resurfaced under new names. The same memo, March 1943, appeared again, stripped of context, classified anew. What had been presented as isolated wartime excesses now looked like a single pipeline. By 1951, more than 700 Paperclip personnel files had been permanently redacted and sealed. Story 10, the project that didn't get a name. There's one project that never received an official name, not because it was small or unfinished, but because it did not belong to any single country. It existed in the overlaps, where files crossed borders, where classification stamps changed, but the redaction stayed the same. After 1945, intelligence officers in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union began encountering a problem. Different archives, different languages, same gaps, entire conclusions missing from otherwise intact research chains, the same phrasing repeated in denial memos, the same justifications for silence, unverifiable, ethically compromised, strategically sensitive, most telling were the markings, declassified documents from unrelated programs, chemical weapons, atmospheric research, undersea surveillance, carried identical classification codes applied years apart by different governments. Analysts noted it quietly. No task force was announced. No inquiry launched. The anomaly was logged and ignored until someone compared timelines. Projects that should have been independent showed coordinated suppression windows. When one nation sealed a file, another followed within months. Personnel associated with controversial work were not just reassigned. They were redistributed, moved into civilian research, folded into defense contractors, disappeared into advisory roles. When whistleblowers surfaced, their testimony was discredited or classified on procedural grounds. One junior archivist noticed something others had missed. Buried in a multinational index was a shared reference number attached to several sealed collections, different titles, same identifier. It appeared on a British naval file from 1943, a U.S. chemical annex from 1947, a Soviet acoustic summary from 1949, and on a set of biological research documents acquired from Japan at the end of the war. The archivist flagged it, requested clarification. Within weeks, his access was revoked. His report was pulled. He was reassigned to records management unrelated to defense. Colleagues later said he stopped talking about work entirely. He died years later without publishing anything. What that shared identifier represented was never defined, but its function was clear. It marked material that crossed a line, not a feasibility, but a precedent, knowledge that could not be uninvented, capabilities that, once acknowledged, would force accountability no victor wanted to face. So the project continued without a name, not as a weapon, not as a program, but as a policy. Suppress the origin, keep the results, reclassify indefinitely. The final file bearing that identifier carries a review date, and until then, it officially does not exist. The 10 projects you just heard are rarely taught together. That omission matters. Viewed in isolation, each can be dismissed as excess, improvisation, or moral failure under pressure. Viewed as a system, a different picture emerges. Again and again, wartime research crossed thresholds. Leaders could not publicly defend once victory was secured. The response was not destruction. It was containment. The knowledge was preserved, redistributed, and renamed. The people were reassigned. The victims were erased from the record. What remained was progress without provenance. This raises an uncomfortable question. If history is written by the victors, who decides which truths are too dangerous to survive victory? One could argue there is nothing deliberate here, that chaos, overlapping bureaucracies, and Cold War urgency explain the gaps, that classification expanded naturally, that ethics lagged behind technology, as they often do. This explanation is clean. It is also incomplete. Bureaucratic failure leaves noise. What we've seen is pattern, coordination, silence that repeats across borders and decades. The real stakes are not about the past. Many systems shaping modern life, surveillance, deterrence, biological research, autonomous delivery, trace their roots to this period. When origins are hidden, accountability collapses. When victims are removed from the story, efficiency becomes the only metric left. That is not a historical problem. It is a human one. Every generation inherits knowledge it did not earn and consequences it did not choose. The question is whether it also inherits responsibility. These files will continue to open. Some truths will surface. Others will remain sealed by design. What happens next depends on how this is remembered. Archive it, or leave it buried.